right, Anthem Church, how we doing today? You good? Feel good? Look good? You guys look good this morning. Hopefully you're ready for week 2 as Citizen. If you are brand new to our church or you weren't here last week, I got some really exciting news for you. We are talking politics. Pretty exciting. Hope you are. You know what they say, right, about holidays or around the dinner table? You don't talk about or we're doing both. Let's go. Let's have some fun. Come on, baby. It's going to be fun. Hey, Citizen, here's what it is. And the truth is, as long as I've been in ministry, politics have been somewhat of a taboo subject as it relates to the church, and for good reason, right? We want to be careful that in the church, the goal is not to move, at least my goal is not to move you left or right, but really to bring heaven down. And I heard a pastor say that this week, and I just felt like that was a perfect articulation of the goal of preaching when it relates to politics, which means it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about politics, but it does mean that we need to be careful and intentional that we're driven by God's word and not by our own agenda. So I don't have an agenda for you today other than I want to help you think through your framework. Now, if you're not a believer in here today, you're going to get an insider conversation around Christians as they think through what it looks like. Is it 23 days from now? 23 days from now, we're going to be voting on the president. We're going to be voting on city council members. We're going to be voting on props. There's a lot at stake here, and most of the news is about the big election, but the truth is there's layers to this, and we just want to have an honest biblical conversation about how you and I have a Christ-centered perspective when we walk into the ballot box. And so that's the whole heart of this thing, right, is that you and I have a Christ-centered perspective. We're calling this series Citizen because before you are a citizen of the country, if you're a follower of Jesus, we believe that you're a citizen of heaven. And heaven is a place where every tribe, tongue, and nation exists. It's where God is on the throne, and it's where we spend all of eternity without the brokenness in this world that we experience daily. And as a result, it's an amazing place to look forward to. Until then, we live in a society where heaven and hell are in competition with one another. Not literally, but the forces on each side are in a competition that we can't see, that plays out in politics in real time. And so as it stands right now, we're called the United States of America. But I don't know about you, it feels like the most divided time that I've ever been alive. Now, people speak to the 60s as something that was chaotic, but right now it feels as chaotic as I can ever remember it. Anybody else with me on this? And so 23 days to what they're saying is the biggest election ever, and until, as Vance joked about a couple weeks ago, until the next election, where it'll be the biggest election ever, and it is a really, really important election. There's a lot of important things on the ballot. We're not going to ignore that here, but let's look at some scriptures to help us give the right perspective on how we go with peace into the ballot box. Colossians chapter 1, we'll begin there just to set the foundation for this conversation. Today, I'm titling my message, A God of Order. If we believe in a God of order, why does it feel so chaotic? What is out of order, and how did it get out of order? And how, as the church, do we participate in getting it back in order? Those are the questions that we seek to answer today, beginning with Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. It says this about Jesus. The Son is the image of the invisible God. So we believe, as Christians, that Jesus, who lived, is God with skin on. He's fully God and fully man, which made him the perfect sacrifice to reconcile the two back together. He lived the life that we couldn't live and ultimately died the death that we deserved in our sin, and then conquered that death, and then ascended into heaven and handed the baton to the disciples in order to bring that message to the rest of the world. The Son is the image of the invisible God. And this doesn't mean a whole lot in our culture, but in Hebrew culture, this means a heck of a lot. He is the firstborn, which gives him authority over all creation. Colossians 1:16 says, for in him all things were created. Now, you don't often think about Jesus in the creation story, do you? You think about Jesus in the Gospels. You think about Jesus in his interaction with the Pharisees and his work on the cross and his conversations with the disciples and in his miracles and in his powerful messages and in the letters in red. But this just gives us a whole nother perspective on Jesus. For in him, remember, who is that referring to in verse 15? Jesus, specifically. For in him all things, by the way, that's the worst straight line ever. For in all things were created, things in heaven. So Jesus is part of the creation story as it relates to heaven, but not just heaven. He also relates to things on what? Earth. Whether it can be seen or not seen, visible or invisible, whether thrones. Now, does our country have a throne? No, you do in your house. Potty joke. But we do have the next. Or powers, or rulers, or authorities. So every power that exists either was created or allowed by God. Now just let that rest. That may bring questions that you want to talk over coffee with about why God would allow. Certainly warranted. Those questions make a lot of sense. But it also, mature Christian in the room, I encourage you that if Jesus is on the throne, if Jesus creates or at least allows everything in power, then my friends, it's an invitation to peace. Because you can trust him even when things are chaotic. All things have been created through him and for him. When I memorized this verse, the way I memorized it was by him and for him. If you just take those 5 words, all things were created by him and for him. The by him means that everything created has value. Why does it have value? What gives something value? What gives something value is who made it, right? The difference between the Mona Lisa you see at Walmart and the one that you visit in the museum is millions of dollars. I think it's now in like the hundreds of millions of dollars. The original Picasso painting, the Mona Lisa. I mean, not Picasso. I see all the art fans like, wrong artist. You're done. Yeah. The original Mona Lisa painting, hundreds of millions of dollars. My understanding is right now it's up in a yacht somewhere. It's not in a museum. It's worth $100 million. It has been in a museum before, but it was purchased, and now it's in a yacht. And the difference between that one and the one you can go buy at Walmart, you get the same size one off Amazon or Walmart. I think the last time I looked, it was $27. What's the difference? Who's the artist, and is it an original? For in him, all things were created. All things have been created through him and for him. Here's what that means. That means every individual created is an original, which gives them value. That's what that means. It means that you are incredibly valuable to God because he created you. But it's not just enough to say that you're valuable. It also is important to say that you're created for a purpose, because not only are you created by him, but you're also created for him. And here's the wild thing about this verse. It's all about Jesus. And one of the most important words in the entire verse is that conjunction that connects your value to your purpose, because it's only by way of the cross that you are able to connect your value to your purpose. Because you were created for a reason, by a God, with intentionality, for a purpose. And the way that you live out that purpose is to be reconciled back to that God, to be informed of who you are, and to live out of your stewardship for every day you have breath. Today, there are many people that woke up and they didn't breathe. You did wake up, and you did breathe. And the question is why? And if I could answer it in 2 words, for him. That's why. So we set the tone, we set the scene. The political conversation was just this reality that we live in a world that feels really, really chaotic, but you worship a God who is in complete control. It'll go on to say this in verse 17. Go ahead, verse 17. It's not just that he creates it, but he is before all things, and in him, all things hold together. And the bumper that I walked out to, the opening scene, did you catch it? It's the camera panning over the moon and catching the earth. And it's been said by many astronauts that have seen this visual, that have had this experience, that what they experience is almost deeply spiritual. And why? Because they've lived on the ground in earth, right? Where everybody's so tribal, right? Do you ever notice that? It's like, well, whose side are you on? In like a Padre game, it's really easy. Like, I'm on those guys' side. But in politics, it gets harder because it's like, I'm on that team. Did you hear what that guy said? I'm not on that team, right? But we have to be on a team. It has to be one or the other. We have to belong to some tribe, somewhere. This is instinctual. It's all over nature. If you watch the Chimp Empire on the Netflix. On the Netflix? What am I, 70? If you turn on the internet and watch the Netflix, it's fascinating because it studies in 4 episodes different chimps in the Amazon. And the tribal nature of the chimps is fascinating. And they're from different regions, and when they cross over regions, they have to fight, and there's an alpha male, and there's politics. It's a fascinating watch. It gives you great perspective on how tribal we are. And yet, when these astronauts come over and see the Earth from a zoomed out perspective, do you know what they think? They don't think, what team am I on? They think, how in the world, for us as a unique creation, how do we keep this thing together? How in the world does God's masterpiece, in the Greek, we're called the poema, how do we figure out how to be unified as he keeps it all together? And one of the things that we're reminded of is that not only did he create it, but as he's holding it together, that we can trust him. And even when things are chaotic, we can participate in what it is to bring it back into order. There's both a prayer aspect of this, where we understand that God is sovereignly in control, and yet there's also this reality that we have choices that we get to make that ultimately can change the outcome of tomorrow. And those things come into partnership together. We need to live like it all depends on us, and we need to pray like it all depends on God. And because in that mystery is the next day we live in. Mm-hmm. In him, all things hold together. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. God's creation has an order and an intentional purpose behind everything. I want to break down this in 4 different ways. If you can put that up on the screen, 4 different ways. God created the individual. God created the family. God created, in the New Testament, God started what we now call the church. It started out as a people, the Israelites, became a nation, became a movement. Okay? That's the church. And then all over the scriptures, you can't go anywhere in the scriptures without a reference to some type of government. Now, the Bible doesn't advocate for one type of government and not the other. It doesn't share that this is good and that is bad, but it does describe how the government is supposed to interact and how we're supposed to interact with the government. And so there's some wisdom here on each one of these things. And if we're going to get our country back in order of God's design, we're going to have to know how these things function. Would you agree? Like, we don't know how these things function. We don't know what the Bible says about these things. Then how in the world are we going to know what to vote for? Because when we go into the ballot box, there's props that want to give power from this to this. There's people that want to give power to this, all this, and take it away from that. Oh, talk about power. I can touch the screen. So there's power moving on the ballot. And if we don't know what the Bible teaches about this, then we're not going to know how to vote. We're going to probably do whatever our party tells us to do. But my friends, you're not a follower of a party. You're a follower of Jesus. And the party that you even subscribe to or align with or are registered to wasn't there in the beginning, didn't create all things, and isn't holding all things together. So I submit to you for your consideration that you would consider the God of order, because in the chaotic political system that we're in, I think both parties have proven that they're not like Jesus. So let's just talk about what Jesus says about these four things. Number one, the individual. The Bible teaches that the individual is an imago Dei and a free agent. Now, let me explain both of these things, because when guys see free agent, they think the Chargers are going to sign them. That's not what I mean by free agent. So free agent just means that you've been given the agency of choice. There's a long philosophical answer to why, but the simplest reason you and I were given choice is because we were created by a God who loved us and wants us to love him back. Love requires a choice. If you don't choose to love, then it's not love at all. Love is patient and love is kind, long description in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but all of it requires that you and I make the choices to love something or someone. You have been given by God free agency, the ability to make your own choices. Now, you are accountable. I am accountable to those choices, but that doesn't change the simple concept that freedom was given to us by God. Freedom is not just an American idea. Freedom is a biblical idea, that each individual has freedom. But before you understand your freedom, we must first understand our dignity. Every person that's ever been created has dignity. Why? 5 words. What are they? By him and for him. You know what that gives you? Dignity. And part of the reason that people are struggling with their identity is because they disconnected the by him and the for him. So they don't know who they are, and they don't know what to do. And when people don't know who they are and they don't know what to do, they fill that void with whatever they can find. And so when we vote, we need to understand that every person is created with dignity and is created with the agency of choice. We should vote accordingly. The family. Now, I want to point out, yeah, you can put that up, keep that up. I want to point out something. Our culture really, really emphasizes the individual, right? It's my rights. It's my freedom. It's my ability to make my choices. And some of those things are true, but we have overemphasized it to the place where it's actually different from the cultures we study in Scripture, which creates a tension because you read the Scriptures through your American individual lens. But that's not how the Scriptures were written. The Scriptures were written in a communal sense, in a familial sense. And so the family is the center for discipleship. Because we're individualistic, we think that the school system educates our kids. The church is the one that disciples our kids. The baseball coach is the one that teaches them baseball, right? Everybody else in the community, and certainly it takes a village, but we're not to delegate our responsibility because the family is the center for discipleship. What is discipleship? What is that fancy word? It's the ability to follow the God you serve. That's what it is. It's the ability to follow the God you serve. And discipleship is the act of teaching and showing and modeling what it is to follow the God you serve. The primary responsibility of discipleship at every level, educationally, spiritually, at every level for your kid, it doesn't mean there's not other people involved. It doesn't mean that you don't invite other people into the story. It doesn't mean that you can't. Listen, right now, I got a 13-year-old girl. She has discovered everything that there is in the world. She knows it all. And I know I'm the biggest doofus on planet Earth. And so I pray for people to come into her life and to share things. And I gotta be honest, sometimes people share things that I've said 1,000 times. And she'll come home and she'll tell me this great revelation she's had. And I'm looking like, oh, I can't believe that she thought of such a dynamic thing to give you this epiphany. And yet I pray for those people. Why? Because even though it's my primary responsibility, I understand the importance of other people in her life, positive influences as she grows older, as those influences grow greater, right? So I'm not delegating my responsibility, but with wisdom in my head and the Holy Spirit in my heart, I can prayerfully ask God to surround her with good people, but also not forego my responsibility as a parent. And I am guilty of this at times, to think that it's somebody else's responsibility because I dropped them off somewhere. But this tension exists. The family vote accordingly. Listen to me. I'm not telling you who to vote for or what prop to vote on. I'm telling you that God instituted the family. You want to know how this is what God created and why it's the right thing? Ask a kid who grew up in the foster care system whether or not that's the way it should be. There's 60,000 in California right now. 60,000 kids. You know who shouldn't raise kids? The government. Not because there's anything against the government, because that's not how God created it. God created the family. Kids belong in a family. That's where they belong. They need a mom, they need a dad. And they need the mom and the dad to show them what it looks like to love each other well. A healthy marriage is a healthy family that raises healthy kids who can be healthy members of society. Vote accordingly. Vote accordingly. There's a tension that exists here. Don't ignore that. And I want you to see that God has created us, individuals, to be a part of a family, which ultimately also leads us to be part of a church and participate in government. More on that in a second. But first, I want to give you, not yet. Will you give me Joshua 24:15, Jeff? I want to give you a verse that just helps to illuminate the role of individual and family, okay? Let me give you some context to this verse before I share it, because you'll see this on a bumper sticker, but many people don't know why this is said, or maybe like on a Hobby Lobby poster. It's a cute verse, for sure. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Here's the context. So the Israelites are moving into what we now call the nation of Israel. A little bit different in terms of geographically, there's some changes along the years, but for the most part, it's the Israelites moving into the nation that we now know to be Israel, okay? As they're moving into that culture, there's already people that live, much like America coming to our land. There's other people that live. There's other cultures. There's other gods. There's other religions, as we would say. And as they're coming into this, Joshua notices that men are meeting women that worship other gods. And this isn't just any other god. This is another god where they believe in child sacrifices, and they believe in a lot of things that go directly against the heart of God, the design of God, and are challenging the people of God who are trying to live for that God. And so as this is happening, chaos starts to happen. And in many ways, other Israelites are passive in that, and they don't know what to do because they like the people, even though they don't like the gods that they serve or worship. And then some of their friends are getting married off, and there's all this chaotic confusion. And Joshua's the new leader. He's different than Moses, comes right after him. And he's moving the people from the promised land from wandering in the desert into the promised land. And in the conclusion of all this chaos, this is what he says. But as for me and my household, you notice the assumption is the family. So it's both an individual's choice and a family decision that says we're going to serve God. But here's also the implication. If it's as for me and my household, what is Joshua also saying in the subtext? That you have a decision to make. The subtext is that you have to decide for your whole household who you're going to serve. But there's a weightiness to this. And the setup is, man, there's a lot of consequences to the decision you make. As for me and my household, listen, I will serve the Lord. Who? Who is the Lord? The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. When you meet my kids, just know who those serve. When you run into my wife, just know who she serves. When you see me and you judge my decisions as a leader for our people, I want you to know where I stand. Don't get it twisted. I serve God. I'll do what he says. He is the driving force behind my decision making. As for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. All right, let's move on to church. Put back up, if you don't mind, church. So we've got individual family. There's a tension that exists between our culture and the culture you read about in Scripture. Don't want you to forget that. Number 3, the church. What is the church? The church shows up on the scene in the book of Acts. And it's a movement, right? So that nation that became Israel ultimately failed miserably. They failed miserably in their desire to be set apart from all of the nations and worship God and God alone. You can read all throughout the Old Testament, one failure after another on the Israelites not doing what they said they would do in the covenant with God. So then they send Jesus. God sends Jesus, who was there in the beginning, to live the life we couldn't live and to die the death we so deserved, like I said, to conquer that death, to ascend into heaven. And he recruits 12 guys. Now, this is going to excite you if you're a knucklehead like me. He doesn't recruit like the top draft picks. Their 40 times aren't good. They probably weren't the most intelligent guy in their class. They're not the most athletic. They're just 12 random guys. They have no position in society at this time, not one of influence or power. They're just selected by Jesus, almost as if Jesus is saying, listen, I'm going to change the world through you guys, so there's no question on who did it. That starts a movement that's outlasted empires, that's outlasted kings, that has outlasted nations. The church is still strong, though many empires have fallen, including Rome, the most powerful empire when the church was born. And so, what is the church? The church is a Jesus community on mission. Now, I've heard it said about Christians that we have an agenda. We have a mission. Is that an agenda? So this notion that we don't have an agenda, we have to be honest with people. We do have an agenda. If you're not a believer, I'll tell you exactly what it is. We have a mission. Here's what the mission is. We believe that God created you with dignity and freedom, and that you have the ability to choose whatever you want. But there are real consequences for those decisions. And the decisions that you make are best made in alignment with the God who created you. And the way that you get aligned with the God that created you is you acknowledge yourself, and I acknowledge myself, that I am imperfect and I'm in desperate need of something outside of myself to bring me back in alignment to God. That person is Jesus. And that Jesus changed my life. And my goal now is to live in such a way that you ask a question of my life on how you get what I have. That's a Jesus community on mission. And that's the movement of the church that has existed for 2,000 plus years. All right? That plays a massive role in society. But it's not the only thing that plays a role in society. The government plays a role in society. The best way I could do it so it fit on the screen is it orders the affairs of a nation. I want to read for you Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1, verse 26. You can go there if you want in the scriptures. I'll read it for you off the screen. It says this: from one man he made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history. So God's not surprised by the rise of a nation. He's not surprised by the fall of a nation. He has appointed times for each one. And he marked out appointed times in history and, say that word with me, boundaries. This is a big topic on the ballot. Borders in the country is, if you're paying any attention, it's a massive, massive subject matter. I want to speak to it directly because there's a lot of curiosity around what does a Christian do with this subject? Because there's some tension in the scriptures with what we do. On one hand, let me just say this without question, Christians love immigrants. And I don't just mean with our words, we're actually called to love immigrants with our resources. We're called to be sacrificial in our generosity towards people, not only that look like us, but in our great country, which really is an experiment, it's an idea. It's the only country in the world where when you watch the Olympics, there's people of literally every background, every color, right, that speak many languages, every other nation. Did you notice? I mean, the world's becoming more diverse, but America started this whole experiment where we'd bring people together. And yet that country, despite its generosity towards immigrants, must have what? To be a nation? Boundaries. And so it is both okay to live sacrificially and to be prayerful and to help those in need, and yet also believe that we must secure our borders to be a nation. And so that I just want to speak to both of those things. Don't get caught up in the mix that you have to choose one or the other. We must. And by the way, part of the government's role is that it should uphold the laws that already exist. That's the government's role. So if we're gonna say what we need to be accountable for, which is delegating our responsibility to other entities, we also need to say bluntly, without choosing one side or another, that the government is also not fulfilling its duty to uphold the law. And we as a people, by the way, you in our government structure, this isn't Bible, this is just the nation that we currently live in. It is for the people, right? It's by the people, for the people. Who's in charge of this country? Who's in charge of this country? You are. We are. The elected officials represent us. And so you and I, in the org chart of our country, where do we sit? It feels like we sit down here, doesn't it? The Constitution says otherwise. The Constitution says we sit up here. We elect officials that are supposed to carry out the will of the people. And so when the will of the people vote in laws, or will vote in people that make laws, and then those people don't uphold those laws, it's not serving its duties. That's not a left issue or a right issue. That's an issue of the role of government. So boundaries is really, really important in this election, and we need to be well researched on where everybody stands on that subject matter in times of history and boundaries of their land. Now I want to read you verse 27 because this is very fascinating. It's a gospel moment in the center of a description about nations. Acts 1, verse 27. God did this. What did he do? What did we just read? He created nations and empires for such a time as this, and languages and different people and different culture. What's the purpose of all of it? Verse 27 tells us, God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps, maybe, just maybe, perhaps, reach out for him. Created in the image of God, every tribe, tongue, and nation, perhaps, maybe, just maybe, that as they live in a culture, as they exist in a world, as they are under different types of government, that they may just see who I am and who they were created to be and reach out to me. And when they reach out to me, what will they do? They will find him, though he is not far from any one of us. What a beautiful verse tucked into a description of nations. As God establishes the church, he doesn't walk away from the role of government in people's lives. And he also reminds us that the whole purpose for different cultures is that they would see one God. If you'll go back to the screen with all four, Jeff. The tension, there's also a tension. I don't have a ton of time to get into this. There's a tension that exists between church and government. And some of this is the church's fault. Okay? There's a long-standing conversation around, and in church history, And even in the early 1900s, a lot went from welfare from the church to the government, okay? That's what started this tension that exists. What's the role of the government? What's the role of the church? And part of it is how our nation was created, right? We didn't want this to be one deal. We didn't want, when you go to a nation, there's only one religion and you have to follow that religion. If you don't follow that religion, then you're going to be punished, right? And put into jail because you don't serve or worship the God of the Pope or of the king or of the president. And so the entire nation was designed, and that's where you get the separation of what? Separation of church and state. Now, that's almost always described to have the church back off of speaking on things. But that is actually said to protect both from each other. Means that we get the freedom to meet and gather as a community with our mission in mind. We get that right. Vote accordingly. Vote for the people that are going to give us the right, and anybody else in our country, the right to worship the God they want to worship. Why? Because the individual is created in the image of God, but they have the ability to choose whether or not they want to worship that God. And you, the Imago Dei, have the ability to choose whether or not you want to worship God. And if you do, you should not be marginalized. And you should not be made to feel stupid. And you should not be made to feel like you're less than, regardless of what our country's history is. Vote accordingly. And finally, we have the right to hold our government accountable, whether it's somebody in power on the right or somebody in power on the left. When you think through props, think through what is the structure that God created, what is out of order, and what props and people will help us bring it back into alignment with God. If you're taking notes, number 2 on your note sheet. A society is most prosperous when it functions in alignment with God's design. For a nation to prosper, we must participate in society. Christians, my friends, it's so easy to get disenfranchised right now. This is the most honest I'll get about politics as it relates to our current context. You can have a different opinion than me. I am not thrilled with the candidates. I'm not thrilled with either one. I don't think either party has put forth the best candidate. You may disagree. You have every right to. You can have reasons why you disagree. But my guess would be that there's a large portion of you in the room that feels the same way. And that tendency gets us to go, maybe I won't vote at all. Maybe I won't participate. In fact, it's so chaotic. Every time I just want to watch a football game, but I got political ads. Anybody just done with these? 23 days, 23 days, 23 days, almost gone. And they're coming at you, and they're negative, and they're like what we would tell our kids not to do. You realize that? The politicians act like what you don't want your kids to act like. It's exactly what you tell your kids not to do. They do. That's where we're at right now. I don't even know what half of them stand for. I just know how the other guy's ugly and stupid and dumb and racist and enter in the attack, both sides. And so for us, we just need to realize that though we want to be disenfranchised right now, a society is most prosperous when it functions in alignment with God. And that means that we must participate. If you don't agree with that, let me show it to you. Just one verse. Jesus was so brilliant. Even if you're not a Christian in the room, listen, you got to study Jesus. It'll help you in your workplace. It'll just study the life of Jesus. It'll help you in your difficult relationships. If you're not a believer in the room, you have difficult relationships. You have people that are after you. You have people that want to corner you. Jesus was better than anybody I've ever read at figuring out how to diffuse conflict, figuring out how to be a peacemaker in the room. He was brilliant at it. He was unbelievable. Even when he was the center of attack, brilliant. He's asked about whether or not they should pay the imperial tax to Rome, because Rome, the leader in Rome is wicked. And the laws of Rome are not in alignment with God, the God they worship and the God they serve. So they're asking, should we pay the tax? Basically, we don't feel like we should enable the government to do evil. So what do you say, Jesus? You see this? What is he going to say? How's he going to answer? Because if he says that we have to pay the tax, he's saying enable evil. But if he says we don't have to pay the tax, he says to break the law. Can't break the law. What do you say? Jesus in his brilliance is like, hey, you got a coin? Then Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Now stop for a second. We just read that everything's God's. And yet, Christians in the structure of society are to participate. Pay your tax. Participate. Understand that there is a law, and Christians should be law-abiding citizens in your community to set an example for those outside of it. That even though you may not agree with who is in power, you are understanding that for society to function, there has to be some level of mutual submission. Now, you hate that. I know you do. Because I do too a little bit. Because it doesn't mean there isn't exceptions to this. There's a biblical exception to this in the book of Daniel. Daniel goes against King Nebuchadnezzar, does not decide to worship the God that King Nebuchadnezzar wants him to or worship him, who he thinks is God, because it violates his belief. There's a biblical precedent that is an exception to this rule. There's also a historical church perspective. When Martin Luther nailed the 95 Thesis on the church door of Wittenberg, what he was doing was calling out the power of the day, the Catholic Church, on all their wrongdoings. And he did this. It wasn't illegal, but it was a tremendous uprooting of the power structure that exists. Or how about Martin Luther King, who broke the law by parading without a permit? And to this day, we have a holiday for Martin Luther King because he had the courage to go against the law. Do you know who was president? Nope. Here's my point in that. Power isn't just positions. Power is influence. So I remind you, even if you don't hold a position of political power, you can still maintain influence with Christ in your heart and the Holy Spirit guiding your decisions. The president was Lyndon B. Johnson. He doesn't have a holiday. So I remind you that this is a powerful moment in time and that we, the people, have power given to us by God. And they were amazed at him. So there is exceptions to this. Let me give you one other verse on this subject, and we'll move on. I got to move quickly because I'm over time. Everyone must submit, Romans 13:1, to governing authorities. Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by who? God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. Is there exception to this? Yes, there is. Does that mean that you have the right to do whatever you want if the ends justifies the means? I said in the first service that there are no exceptions, and I got challenged by this, and I was correctly challenged. There are very few exceptions for a Christian to do what they want and justify that because the ends justify the means. There are very few biblical stories or examples of that. So I just remind you that you may think you're the next one, but it's more likely than not that you aren't. Number 3, if you're taking notes. Christians should be law-abiding citizens who are active and prayerful in their communities. We need Christians running for local office. We need Christians running for senator. We need Christians running for president. We need Christians running for school boards. We need Christians running for all different types of positions in our community. And we also need Christians who aren't running for politics to also be prayerful. And we need at bare minimum Christians to vote. Did you know that Christians, last election, 30 million Christians didn't vote? Do you know the election was decided by 42,000 people? 30 million, you know what that means? That's Christian. That's 30 million Christians sitting at home saying, I delegate my authority to people that don't believe in God. So that means I will delegate the future of our country. I won't participate. The country that exists for my kids, I won't participate. I get feeling disenfranchised. I get feeling like you can't get behind anybody. I get all of that. I'm just telling you, you and I both need to participate with the framework, okay? We know both politicians are deeply flawed. I'm talking about the presidents now. They are deeply flawed. And listen, you and I need to be careful that we're not justifying one person's lies because we want them to win the president while we call out the other person's lies. If you're taking notes, you can put number 4 down, that Christians should not show favoritism. James chapter 2. The context is to the rich, but I'm going to put it in the context of political parties. You should not show favoritism to one candidate or the other. When one lies, they should be called out. When the other lies, they should be called out. Lying is not something you should stand for as a Christian, no matter who you're voting for. And they're lying out of their teeth like crazy right now. That's the truth. Both parties in the last couple of weeks have either avoided answering questions or have lied, both candidates. As Christians, that should not be acceptable, no matter who you're voting for. But what we do is we laser in on the one we're not voting for and the one we're scared to get into power, and we ignore the other one. You know what that is? That's called favoritism. You know what James chapter 2 says? When you and I show favoritism, we will suffer the consequences. We will stand before a holy God, and he will remind us that we played favorites because the ends justifies the means. Number 5, Christians should be trustworthy in the information they share. Just several weeks ago, maybe 5-6 weeks ago, I saw pastors on social media posting that Biden was dead. Maybe he was dead. Pastors. Now, listen, I understand that many of us have seen something go from conspiracy theory to truth. That's happened over the last 4 years. That's just a fact. Conspiracy theories that were made fun of have become true. Some of them didn't, though. Christian, I remind you, some of them didn't. Some of them did. And when you share information that you receive without fact-checking it because it satisfies your agenda and yet disrupts the truth, you're not serving your God. You and I should be the most trustworthy people with information, with non-believers and believers. When you say something, oh, you know what? When Chase speaks on that, I'm going to tell you something like he's researched, and when he's not sure, he tells me he's not sure if it's true or not. We are the most trustworthy people with information. We should be. After all, our God is the God of truth, and the one that's trying to steal, kill, and destroy is his native language is deception. And many of us are completely okay with participating in deception if it helps our candidate win. Christian, stop. Stop. Don't do that. You're not serving your God. The ends does not justify the means. So favoritism and trust and ultimately looking at information so that we can win an election is not something we participate in. Should we be informed? Yes. Should we vote according to God's design? Yes. But should we also not only have a Christ-centered perspective, but also have a Christ-centered character? And the answer to that is? Listen, I'm not saying I'm not guilty of these things. And I'm not saying these things aren't hard to hear. But we as a church need to not only encourage each other, but challenge one another. And this stakes are high, emotions are high, and a lot is in play. Here's my encouragement to you. That you and I would prayerfully consider that God is on the throne. That would bring a peace, but it will also bring a perspective. and we'd walk into the ballot box understanding that God has an intentional design behind everything. And every box I check is to bring the world that I live in alignment with the world God created. We may disagree on what that looks like. We may disagree on whether or not I check this box or you check that box. But that should be the driving principle behind everything. And I go back to Colossians 1:15 because I'm way over. I'm going to read it for you one more time. Very quickly. Colossians 1:15. He's getting there. I'll read it for you here. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Verse 16. For in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority. All things have been created through him and for him. Verse 17. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So I remind you of the simple song that many of you learned when you were just a young girl or a young boy. He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 So God, may the words of a simple lullaby be the words that our heart marinate in, that our minds are focused on, that our souls find rest in. Not that we would advocate our responsibility, but God, we would fully participate in what our society is currently in this moment in time, the political realities, God, that we would, with peace and a proper perspective, participate. But God, also that you would be with us, that you would meet us here in this room, that you would inform us, that you would convict us, that you would challenge us, that you would encourage us. God, all the things necessary for us to do what you have called us to do. For after all, we're created by you and for you. It's in Jesus' name we pray.